And we are live.
Welcome, everyone, to this webinar on Outsmarting Nature. It is put on by Etc. Group and the Heinrich Boll Foundation, as well as Scene Energy. I am the host, Tom Philpott, the food and agriculture reporter for Mother Jones Magazine, and I'm very excited to be part of this conversation because I write about food and ag, and I try to have as global a perspective as possible because it is impossible not to. And when you write about this now, you have to have a global perspective, and you also have to understand a lot about emerging technologies. And for these two things, for this sort of intersection of the global food system and emerging technologies and the sort of corporations and corporate power that controls the emerging technologies, the group that I go to understand these things is Etc. Group. And Etc. Group, about 6 or 7 months ago, put out a report that is called Outsmarting Nature, Synthetic Biology and Climate Smart Agriculture. And it is a critique of this emerging concept of climate smart agriculture that the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization is pushing, and that has drawn lots and lots of corporate partnerships from some of the biggest seed and pesticide companies in the world. And so ETC Group, as it always does, has given us a very lucid explanation of these forces, these emerging technologies, the corporate interests behind them, how they tie into the sort of global development world through the FAO. And so this report is something that anyone who's interested in this topic should read. And so we have Pat Mooney, who's the executive director of Etc. Group, and really needs no introduction to probably most people listening to this, a very important figure in this sort of documenting and understanding and critiquing these sort of emerging technologies and that public-private partnerships that they're embedded in. And we also have, I'm very excited to listen to and learn from two other people here. One of them is Ramona Duminicioi. She's a peasant farmer in Romania, which is basically the epicenter of peasant farming in Europe now. Eastern Europe is where smallholders still exist and still feed people and provide food for people in Europe. And Ramona is here representing La Via Campesina, which is an international peasant movement that represents 200 million peasants worldwide, small and medium-sized farmers, landless people, women farmers, indigenous people, migrants, and agricultural workers around the world. We're also joined by, coming to us live from Devon, England, Teresa Anderson. She's a policy officer on climate and resilience for ActionAid International, which is a social justice organization with offices in 45 countries, and she's going to be giving us her perspective on these questions. But we're going to start with Pat, and I say he needs no introduction, but I have to say that he's been writing incredible stuff for something like 4 decades. I think one of the real sort of foundational books in understanding seed rights, the importance of biodiversity, the sort of corporate attack and wrapping up of and shrinking of biodiversity. There's a book that he co-wrote in 1990 called Shattering. Everyone should read it. Pat has won numerous awards. And Pat, why don't you start us off by summarizing what's in the report and these sort of broader forces at play here.
Well, thanks very much, Tom. That's very kind.
I think I should start off actually by apologizing. I think I'm the one that delayed everything this morning or and this afternoon, depending on where you are on this call. Um, I got outsmarted by not nature, but outsmarted by technologies, trying to sort
Yes.
out when I'm traveling to get onto the right system here. Um, but this is an issue that certainly is alarming us now, because in the guise of responding to climate change, to get us to food security in 2050, as they say, to try to make sure that we survive the vicissitudes of nature in the decades ahead with climate change. Companies are taking advantage of that to be able to say, well, we can help you with food, but you have to give us the technologies and the power of those technologies to do what we need to. And in order to use those technologies, we need to be of a scale, of a global scale, that lets us use the science the way it has to be done. So with the excuse of of course, the reality of climate change, we're getting a handful of companies and perhaps governments, frankly, who are working together to make sure, again, that they have the corporate strength, the corporate size that they want to have to move technologies which most of us haven't even heard of. And most of those technologies come in the shape of variations of synthetic biology. These are synthetic biology has been described sometimes as sort of extreme genetic engineering or genetic engineering on steroids. But it's a range of activities which can play out in two very different areas. In one area, and we talk about climate smart agriculture, it is the theory that we'll be able to uh, change DNA, to tweak DNA, to drive DNA in a way that will let us adapt to climate conditions quite rapidly. And it's a theory, it's not a reality yet, but the work is going on by the companies, and they're saying that this is not going to be your standard genetic modification, the GMOs that we've all heard about. This is going to be outside the regulatory system. There are no regulations for it, because they claim it is natural. It is a natural way to just change the A, C, Gs, and Ts of DNA in order to give us new traits that can be driven into our crops and then can be spread around the world. Secondly, the companies are saying that they can use these new breeding techniques, synthetic biology, to in fact create natural products in a vat rather than in the field, so that flavors and fragrances and so on, even biofuel crops, could be, instead of taking up space on our land and competing with food, could actually be brewed in vats in Brazil or in Switzerland, and could replace, again, other products that are in the field, and would still be called natural. It would naturally also eliminate jobs and employment for tens of thousands and actually millions of farmers around the world. But again, these are strategies that they're talking about. And they're doing this again in this framework of needing to respond to climate change, and the strategy which was announced by them, 22 governments and companies together in 2014, to tell to the world that don't worry, we're on this case. We're going to take care of climate issues with the food issues, and just give us a free hand to do that. They've been strongly backed by, the companies have been strongly backed by governments like the Netherlands and Norway, Ireland, Canada, the United States, very much pushing the interests of these companies. Companies themselves are led in some parts, at least, by Monsanto, but DuPont and all the major players are involved, Unilever and so on, through the system, are all working together to promote this strategy and trying to get global support for, again, what they describe as climate smart agriculture. Which makes you kind of wonder, like, what was the world doing for the last 12,000 years if that wasn't smart?
Right.
But they are proceeding with all of that. We should also see that this is in the context of several changes that are going on. One of them is that and I don't want to tie everything back to the United States, but certainly we saw with the Obama administration coming on, there was a major change in strategies by the food and agricultural companies, not just in the United States, but around the world. Suddenly the budget for lobbying in places like Washington and Brussels more than doubled very, very quickly from previous years. Suddenly their investment in national lobbying as well as in regional lobbying, like at the European Union level, changed again. More money by far going into that strategy than before. And then, again, the very careful, and that was around 2008, 2009, And then they also started to make coalitions that we've never seen before. We saw Walmart going to USAID and saying, hey, we can produce climate-smart agriculture in Central America. We'll work with you to help so-called peasant farmers improve their ability to export to Walmart. Then we saw, most surprisingly of all, in 2014, Unilever pairing up with the International Fund for Agricultural Development, a United Nations agency in Rome, and saying to them, let's work together to help peasant farmers around the world, whether they're growing sorghum in Africa or millets in Asia. We can use the market know-how of Unilever with the peasant knowledge that IFAD claims to have, and we can have a joint strategy for this. We saw the Pan American Health Organization doing the same thing in terms of nutrition issues in Latin America, saying we can cooperate now with major companies, and they have received funds from companies like Unilever and I think Monsanto and Nestle. I forget the list of companies right now, saying we'll work with them to again promote better nutrition in Latin America. So this is a different strategy and a different way that we've seen in the past, where we've seen companies really blurring the line between the public and private sectors in the interests of so-called climate-smart agriculture. And that, of course, is what's behind the mergers we're seeing now. We're seeing that the mega mergers that may link Monsanto with Bayer, DuPont with Dow, and Syngenta with ChemChina. But those mergers between seed and pesticide companies, which would create a market which would have 60% of the world's seeds and 70% of the world's pesticides controlled by just 3 companies, that's really just the beginning of all of that. Because at the other end of the food system, we're also seeing the major food processing companies also developing their strategies using the same kind of synthetic biology technologies and big data management to get a tight grip on that part of the system as well. So we are at a point where I think through the guise of climate-smart agriculture, we're seeing a kind of a sea change where the entire food chain, from one end to the other, are looking for new consolidations and seeing how they can use genomics and data to really control much more of our food system than they ever have before in the past.
Pat, one question that that I've been having recently is that if you look at the sort of GMO era, let's say the mid 1990s until pretty recently, the companies did a really great job of grabbing global market share. And, when you guys wrote this report a few months ago, there were 6 companies that had about 60% of seeds, and as you just said, we're moving rapidly to probably having 4 pretty soon if Monsanto ties up with either BASF or Bayer. It seems likely too. So they grabbed all this market share, but the technology itself ended up being, in some ways, a bit of a paper tiger. Like, all of that, all of those years, 15, nearly 20 years, and we basically have 2 traits in the market: herbicide tolerance and BT. Those are the only traits that really exist in the world. And I think a lot of that ends up being about the limits to the technology. I mean, you write in the report about the struggles for drought-tolerant corn, and it ends up being a really complicated thing to create something as complex as the way that a plant deals with water isn't something that's going to be easily changed in a desirable way by adding 1 or 2 genes. And I'm wondering if you can talk through, is this next generation of synthetic biology, do you think it will be as transformative as the industry says? Because the first generation was not. I mean, by now we were supposed to, with conventional GMOs, have beautifully drought-tolerant corn. Nitrogen use efficiency was going to go through the roof. There was talk not that long ago of nitrogen fixing corn with first generation GMO technology. How seriously, I think the corporate power angle is something that we need to take incredibly seriously. How seriously should we be taking these technologies? Do they really have potential to transform things?
I think we have to be very cautious about it. It's cautious in both senses, that yes, it could be another paper tiger, but yes, it may not be, and we have to watch it very, very closely for that reason. But you're absolutely right that what we learned from the first generation of GMOs was that technologies don't have to be scientifically sound in order to be financially profitable.
Right.
So companies that made a lot of money by chasing everybody else out of the marketplace. Before the GMO era came along, we had 7,000 different seed companies around the world developing plant varieties. Now again, we're down to about having 3 or 4 that are going to control the vast majority of the commercial seed market. So it's they got what they wanted by saying, folks, this new technology is coming, it's too important to ignore, it's very expensive, the risks are high, give us the intellectual property protection that we need, give us the market share we need, and we'll take it over from there. And now they're saying that to us again. Climate change is coming, folks. We need to create a space for this new synthetic biology technology. It's bigger and better than anything you've ever seen before, but you've got to give us the elbow room we need to, and the corporate size we need to really command this technology on a global scale. So yeah, we should be cautious about it. We've been here before. We've heard these stories before. The fact still is that they can cause a lot of damage. Bad technologies still can be tremendously destructive. And they're destructive not just in terms of the field that they're in. They're destructive in terms of the regulatory systems that they transform. They're destructive in terms of the intellectual property systems that they change. And they're very destructive in terms of the kind of broad rural development policies that that they may be advocating on behalf of their interests and not the interests of peasant producers. I think people like Teresa and her work with Action Aid and Ramona with the Via Campesina see that end of it, where the actual, beyond the technology itself, it's the political muscle of the companies doing this that actually transforms the policies that make it impossible for peasants to do what they do best, which is grow good food for us.
Right. And of course, quietly, the end result of the GMO era was to enshrine herbicides, and it ended up being an excellent herbicide marketing tool. And that obviously is an extremely damaging and not very climate-friendly kind of a thing. Well, I guess in the interest of time, I could talk to Pat about this all day, but we should probably move on. And so what we got there was a sort of what's going on at the sort of top in the corporate boardrooms and the suites, executives talking to government officials about and UN people about how to tweak climate how to tweak regulations and policy to make it friendly for these kinds of this kinds of corporate power. Now let's talk a little bit about what's going on the ground and what and maybe some actual ways that people are dealing with climate change that don't involve these technologies. So let's start with Teresa. So Teresa, I wonder if you could talk us through the climate smart agriculture agenda, which is this agenda that Pat's been describing, and why it matters for people actually on the ground working in agriculture who don't wish to be part of this sort of global production scheme.
Well, thanks, Tom, and thanks, Pat. I think the first thing to say, obviously, is that climate change is really a reality for every farmer probably on the planet would say that they are noticing the impacts of climate change, that climate change is making farming, making food production more and more difficult. I don't think there's a single farmer out there that would deny that is the truth. But what we know, I mean, even like this year with the combined impact of El Nino with climate change, we're seeing possibly the most widespread ever hunger emergency and drought and crop failure. So clearly we do need serious solutions out there, and we do need like collective efforts on the ground and at all levels to be pulling together to figure out how we can grow food now and in the future. But what we're seeing, as Pat was describing, is this emerging framing of climate-smart agriculture that really doesn't address any of the needs that farmers on the ground actually have. I mean, the term climate-smart agriculture has been bandied around for quite some time now. It was put forward by the FAO and the World Bank together. They were trying to envision a kind of agriculture that they said could could mitigate climate change, that could help farmers adapt and increase yields, so could, in theory, produce a triple win for agriculture in the face of climate change. So this wonderful rhetoric came through that got a lot of people very excited. But along with that rhetoric, there were no definitions or criteria of what actually could be climate-smart agriculture. So what we've seen, as Pat touched upon, is corporations like Monsanto claiming that they have the mission solution to climate change by if you grow their Roundup-ready crops and spray herbicide everywhere so that the weeds die back, then you can reduce the amount of tillage required, and that reduces emissions, and so that's good for the climate. So basically that they should possibly even sell carbon offsets, or at least pitch this as a climate change mitigation solution. Whereas we know for sure that this is that promoting GM is not a solution for farmers. We've seen how farmers all over, particularly in North America as well as Latin America and even in some other parts of the world, have really suffered, especially small farmers, have really suffered from being displaced or being into debt by GM crops. Other solutions that are being pitched as climate smart are, for example, Syngenta, another big agricultural corporation, is trying to make claims that they can produce climate smart agriculture. For example, they say that actually they can create sustainable intensification of agriculture. Mm-hmm. So if you use more fertilizers and pesticides on their crops, then you can, in theory, increase yields and therefore reduce the pressure on land and ecosystems, mm-hmm. which by their logic could be a climate change solution. Alternatively, you have this quest for producing GM drought-tolerant crops, which, as we hear, has never turned into a reality yet. So you have basically big agribusiness just trying to find a way to greenwash what they already produce with more climate wash, really. So again, they've got a solution, which is their technology. Now they need to find a problem, and climate seems to be the problem that they can claim to fix with their solution. But as we've seen, industrial agriculture is not a solution for small farmers. I mean, organizations like Grain have done great studies, as well as ETC, showing that small farmers are the ones that produce far more food per hectare. The small farmers are the ones feeding the world on far less land, and therefore small-scale agriculture is far more efficient for food security. And also, in the face of climate change, diverse agriculture is far less vulnerable to climate change than industrial agriculture. Like if you have monocrops, it's like putting all your eggs in one basket. And so it means that in many parts of the world, we have extreme drought and crop failure happening, largely because farmers are dependent on modern hybrids and monocultures, which require a lot of water. So a shift to this modern agribusiness style of agriculture is going to increase farmers' vulnerability and the vulnerability of our food systems in the longer term. So that's the lesson from climate smart agriculture so far, I would say. And I think with these new emerging approaches of synthetic biology, it gets a bit more complex, but I think that clearly none of those solutions on the ground are what farmers really need.
Right. So the tragedy here, it seems like, is that the world's farmers, including smallholder farmers, have real challenges from climate change and could use support. But instead of getting support, they're getting, the policymakers at the national level and at the sort of transnational, UN level are instead making partnerships with these companies to produce these sort of fake solutions in search of a problem. And so why don't we use that as a way to transition to what peasant farmers are doing on the ground, and let us get some perspective from Ramona. Ramona, can you talk us through how you and your colleagues at Via Campesina approach this climate smart agriculture business?
Yeah, there have been already a few years since La Via Campesina started denouncing the climate smart agriculture, which was presented to us as a combination of agroecology and industrial agriculture, like a solution for climate change and the mechanism for sustainable development. And in the last few years, my colleagues from La Via Campesina and even myself made a lot of interventions against the climate smart agriculture at different policy levels all around the world, at the FAO level, at the European level, and so on. And for us, it's quite clear what this climate smart agriculture is about. We see it as part of a larger process of greening, greening adjustment imposed by an economic system and political elites that have exhausted the other places for speculative financial investments, and now they are seeing in agriculture and in the agriculture land a new frontier to conquer. It's a continuation of the so-called Green Revolution, which decimated the peasantry and small-scale agriculture and small-scale farming economies, particularly in the south, in a very short amount of time, in a few decades, weakening the food systems, making the global south dependent on the north to feed their populations. In the same time, the climate smart agriculture is also a continuation of using toxic chemicals, and a continuation of corruption of genetic resources, which are the basis of our food and agriculture, starting from hybrid seeds to new genetically modified technologies, which obviously result in loss of biodiversity. It's a project that is dictated by the need of expansion of this industrial capital, which is increasing exploitation of agricultural rural workers, migrant workers, and so on. It's basically a food system that is under the control of corporation, large industrial farms, who are who become the main beneficiaries. A very concerning fact is that it will lead to further land consolidation, land grabbing, pushing peasants and their families out of their lands, and pushing them in the arms of World Bank with their projects of that create dependency on new technologies and credits, while ignoring our traditional farming, our traditional seeds, and our traditional food systems. The idea also of increasing productivity that is included in this climate smart agriculture, including productivity, increasing productivity in a sustainable way, it's false and very dangerous, because it only increases income for corporations, it increases income for financial market speculators and large landowners. And more and more we realize how we peasants and smallholder family farmers have to produce crops for the commodity market and not for local and regional food systems. Peasants, farmers, are starting now producing more and more for corporations who are manufacturing toxic processed food, pharmaceuticals and so on, basically the overall result has been the loss of food security and food sovereignty. And what we propose as La Via Campesina is what we do, what we put in practice every day, which is agroecological production, the construction of people's food sovereignty, which is a different model of agriculture and food production that will provide a just economic well-being for small-scale farmers and their communities, while producing enough healthy food for meeting people's nutritional needs and for guaranteeing access to food for everyone. Myself, I am a seed producer, and I am directly affected by new technologies. I work with local varieties of seeds, heirloom seeds, which are nowadays endangered. Anyway, the legislation that is in place is already not friendly with peasants and with their peasant seeds, with their traditional seeds. But we can say that at least in some parts of the world, the legislation was not so strongly enforced. But ever since this project of climate smart agriculture has been pushed more and more, we see how governments sanction farmers who try to make a living from seed production, from using healthy seeds to produce healthy food. And more we see how the market is taken over by modern, highly technological seeds.
Maybe I can open this up to all three of you and ask, talk me through an alternative approach that I think we can say that falls under the rubric of agroecology as an alternative to these sort of high-tech patented solutions that these industries are selling. Talk me through what agroecology means and what kind of policy regime, both on national levels and on the international sort of UN level, would take to sort of support that and not, as I think is currently the case, fight against it. What sort of, I guess it's a two-part question. First, what is agroecology, and how can it be supported by public institutions?
Yeah, agroecology is not just referring to a practice, an agricultural practice. It refers to the process that leads to taking decision in agriculture, and the way and the process that is creating the food systems from around the world. We are at the moment not included in the decision-making process, and this is what agroecology is also about. It's about the rights the right to be consulted, to say your opinion, and we as farmers need to be consulted because we are the basis for the majority of food production. And the ones who will suffer the most from the loss of biological and agriculture biodiversity is us. We are in the first line that is confronting with the effects of climate change, the effects of the food crisis, the effects of the economic crisis caused by all of these bad things we're talking about: climate smart agriculture, green revolution, bad capitalist economic system. When we talk about agriculture, let's not forget that it has a very strong social component that is about human rights, peasant rights. So this is the most important element, we think, that must be taken into consideration when we talk about an alternative system. It's about an alternative way of taking decisions, because the better solutions come from the people, from the ground. One of the main reasons we are now in this complicated situation is because only a very limited elite of political decision makers and powerful economic actors are part of decision making.
It's also a different way of looking at the farm. High-tech approaches have historically looked at the soil or the seed or chemicals or some specific narrow aspect of the production system. In agroecology, it's really a wide tech approach. It's looking at the entire farm, how it functions together, strategizing based upon and developing new technologies based upon traditional knowledge of peasant and indigenous agriculture, and going from there to again look holistically at how to improve the production capacity. We already know that without the benefit of the industrial food chain, peasant agriculture is producing about 70% of the world's food, and it's doing it with significantly less than 30% of the resources that agriculture commands around the world, whether it's water or fossil fuels and so on. It's already very, very effective. But to give some examples of the capacity of the peasant system to produce through agroecology compared to the industrial system. Companies, since the beginning of industrial agriculture, which was back to the 1960s, let's say, have produced about 120,000 different plant varieties, so really about 100 crops. At the same time, have actually bred more than 2.1 million plant varieties of 7,000 crops. Mm-hmm. So who's going to get us through climate change more successfully? Is it going to be the peasant system with massive diversity and creativity, or is it going to be a very small group of companies that deal with very few crops? And again, almost all of it is planted on just 8 crops. And something like 40% of all corporate research in plant breeding is just on corn, on maize. Right. So they can't get us anywhere with that system. If we look at livestock, it's exactly the same. The peasant system works with 40 different species. It works with almost 8,000 different breeds of livestock. While the companies work with no more than 5 species, and they work with fewer than 100 breeds of livestock. So again, responding to the pressures of climate change, the peasant system is much more efficient, much more effective, and that peasant system linked to agroecology really can make sure the world is safe and we have food sovereignty in 2050.
And maybe just to add a little bit more on why agroecology really is the solution in the face of climate change. Because if you, I don't know if everybody realizes that, but synthetic fertilizers actually kill the microbes, the fungi, the bacteria, etc. in the soil, which are the things that give a lot of the carbon, good carbon bulk, that spongy texture that holds water and provides nutrition. So every time you put fertilizer in the soil, you're actually killing the very thing that will hold the water and nutrition for your crops. If instead you add compost and manure and cover crops and mulches, etc., then you're actually adding to that soil carbon and that life and that spongy texture in the soil, which means that the soil holds much more water. So when drought happens, there's a lot more water available in the soil for crops to grow. And also when floods happen, there's a lot more, the soil can absorb a lot more water, and the crops are less likely to be washed away during flood events as well. So we've seen, I've talked to a lot of farmers, all over the world actually. I work with small-scale farmers in many countries who are trying to figure out how to do adaptation, and I asked them, what have you found to be the most effective, adaptation technique? And they all say agroecology, moving away from these chemicals, using organic agriculture. This has been the best thing. We had no idea. We were told for decades that this fertilizers, these hybrid seeds were the solution, but now we see that improving the soil with our own materials, and also going back to our own locally adapted seed diversity, is the best strategy. There are some other things as well that governments can do to improve adaptation opportunities, like early warning systems, and maybe doing activities that can help protect communities against rising sea levels, etc. These kinds of things. But at local level, really agroecology for farmers is the best tool they have. Pat was alluding to, but my sound cut out a little bit. If we project ourselves a few decades or possibly a century into the future, we really need to make sure that we have this seed diversity in the hands of farmers so that they can continue to breed and adapt and evolve crops to future climate and food challenges. Because at the moment, if we put all of our seed diversity into, the hands of corporations, and those corporations, may not exist in a few decades' time, who is going to ensure that we have the food diversity and that genetic pool available to farmers to be able to grow food in the future? So for me, this is, the way that climate-smart agriculture and even this progression towards synthetic biology is really putting the future of food in the hands of the laboratories and away from the hands of the farmers. And not just for now, but for the future, we really need to make sure that the control over our food systems is in the hands of the farmer.
Yeah, and I've even seen here in the United States, in the heart of industrial agriculture in places like Iowa, farmers are not using the word agroecology, but they are using the methods. I mean, not in a widespread way, but I've seen regular conventional farmers learn that building organic matter in soil with stuff like cover crops is a way better, and also fixing nitrogen with cover crops, legume cover crops, is a way better way to go than just relying on annual doses of fertilizers. In the meantime,
it's way more cost efficient if you consider the hundreds of millions spent on developing crops rather than actually just taking manure and sticking it in your fields. I mean, It's clearly a cost-benefits equation there.
Oh yeah, and there's a great cost-benefit equation for the farmer, but for these companies themselves, not so much, because they're not selling as many inputs, and so that's why we don't hear as much about it in in policy circles. So we have a couple of questions that have come over the pike. One of them is something I've written about before, so I'm quite curious about too, and I think this is for Pat. Whatever happened to that vanilla product by Evolva? I feel like it was commercialized here in the United States. This is a synthetically engineered vanillin. So what they did was they figured out that 4 or 5 flavor compounds in vanilla, which is grown in fields by farmers in the global south, and figured out a way to engineer it in a vat with synthetically engineered bacteria and yeast, and it was going to replace vanilla and be this big profit center. And I wrote about it about a year and a half ago, and I'm not sure what's going on with that. So Pat, can you fill us in? And is it already affecting farmers in the field? And I apologize for the echo if anyone else is hearing it.
It's not a big factor yet in the marketplace, but it has moved ahead exactly as the companies had planned. They are claiming it's a natural product. They are able to. The technology is working for them. Synthetic biology is producing the product. The direct target for the company, Evolva in Switzerland, is to replace the high-end vanilla that's grown by farmers, for example, in Madagascar and some other parts of East Africa and in Mexico, of course. And their goal is to come in at a price level which is well below the very high price of high-quality natural vanilla, but still well above the price of the chemical vanilla that we get in our worst products, that are very, very crappy vanilla that we often see in processed foods. So they're moving ahead, and 100,000 farmers are at risk by that. And it's not just vanilla. It's also, there's well over 100 products now, and we can't track them all because there are no regulations that force the companies to make this information available. But from stevia in Paraguay through to saffron in Iran, there is a move toward getting these products again out of the field and into factories where they're high-quality products and where they can avoid the farmer altogether. That's moving more successfully, perhaps, than we even thought. This was first developed in the 1970s by companies, and in the early 1980s, and the bioprocessing technologies didn't work well then. This is another kick at the can, but this time they seem to be getting it into the marketplace.
One thing that I was impressed by when I looked into this is that I remember in the kind of mid-2000s, there was a lot of hype around biomass, that these companies were going to engineer bacteria and yeast and whatnot that would convert biomass directly into ethanol or directly into biodiesel or whatever, and it was going to transform.
These are exactly the same companies.
It's the same companies. It's the exact same companies, and it seems to me a dramatic ramping down of ambitions. Because if you're going to I am going to create the fuel that drives cars in North America or in the United States, where we have 310 million cars, to I'm going to take the vanilla in your chocolate chip cookie. It's a dramatic ramping down of ambitions, and talk me through what that means. Is that just are we going to get biofuel production from this down the road? That seems to be also a significant threat everywhere if biomass becomes that easily made into a product. So talk me through what's going on there.
Well, the companies, I think, their eyes were bigger than their mouths, and they had to convince Wall Street that they could produce amazing things. And so we had companies like Amyris and others who started off by saying that yes, they would produce biofuels that wouldn't compete with food crops, still using sugarcane as an energy base or maize as an energy base, but they would do that. And they found that scaling up to the massive scale of the billions of barrels of oil to match that per year was much harder to do. So they said, well, let's go back and look at high profits, high value flavor and fragrance crops that we can produce on a much smaller scale than ethanol, and see if that works. And that is working for them. They are able to do that, although there's going to be, I think, a very strong consumer backlash against that stuff being forced down our throats. But while the companies are moving in the flavors and fragrances, they haven't given up on the biofuels. They still are pursuing that area of research. And they've even gone one step worse than that, because what they're saying now is we can actually use the technologies that we've developed in synthetic biology to do these other products, and we can turn that into a way of actually forcing in shale oil production and other wells, we can actually force shale gas, shale oil, use the enzymes we've created to get more oil out of the ground. So the company that 10 years ago was saying we're going to get rid of these awful fossil fuels are now saying we're going to help the fossil fuel industry get more stuff out of the ground. The same companies, and they're also the ones that are telling us that they're going to give us natural food products, whether it's stevia or vanilla or drugs in the case of artemisinin.
So what you just mentioned, Pat, is a remarkable intersection between synthetic biology, agriculture companies, and fracking, which would be quite a combination to unleash upon the world.
Kind of hard to imagine that they can make that kind of intellectual leap, or perhaps the intellectual leap isn't so hard, but the moral leap is a bit challenging.
If I may, Tom?
Yes.
If I would like to also make an intervention after that.
Yes, please.
Okay, so I'll just say quickly that on that we'll have a different webinar that is actually precisely on the connection between fracking and synthetic biology in the upcoming weeks. So for those listening, stay tuned.
So Ramona, please.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to the big picture and to acknowledge the fact that the direction that is pointed by projects like sustainable, like CSA, this climate smart agriculture, and synthetic biology, is the entire direction is wrong, and we need to look back, and we need to acknowledge that we need a systemic change, profound change, and we need to change direction towards what's good for local economies, what's empowering vulnerable people such as women. I want to actually make a special point about the role of women in agriculture and the importance of acknowledgement and respect for the very extraordinary contribution that women bring to building agroecology and to building an alternative and solution for climate change and for the food crisis and so on, and the fact that there is this disproportionate responsibility for unpaid work for women, and the need for empower and respect of their human rights. It's an issue that must be more profoundly discussed and more profoundly acknowledged. Also, the increasing need for new farmers in agriculture is it's a reality that if it's ignored, our framework, our political framework, the food sovereignty, the agroecology, are also endangered, just as endangered as the false solutions are. And the going towards local markets, national markets, regional markets, territorial markets, it's another direction that it's very, very important, an economic direction that is going hand in hand with what peasant farming and food sovereignty is all about. We, as La Via Campesina, are present and part of all the debates of all levels. We believe that we have the necessary drive and knowledge to propose concrete, practical, adapted solutions for all regions. And we believe very much in cooperation, and we believe very much in complementary knowledge. So, just as a final point, I trust very much the future and our future contribution to change, decisions at the policy level, and because we are what we are proposing, we are already practicing food sovereignty in the ground.
Yeah, and okay, so Teresa, why don't you add something to that, please?
Yeah, thanks. You raise a good point, Ramona, and I just wanted to raise this point, which I don't think has been discussed much about climate-smart agriculture and gender. But Ramona, would you possibly mute, because I think I'm echoing? The point is that as we've seen in the past decades with the transfer of agriculture from traditional systems, with women farmers in many cases, women often growing food for the family and like a range of indigenous traditional nutritious crops, and as we've seen the shift to industrial agriculture, really undermining the agriculture of women all over the world and the role of women on their land, because cash crops tend to appeal more to men and to large-scale farming. We've seen a steady undermining of women's agriculture with the shift towards cash crops and industrialization of agriculture. And I think climate-smart agriculture techniques, tools, technologies, and particularly with any future synthetic biology crops will probably just exacerbate that trend and undermine women's agriculture, women's rights, and the nutrition of families, and also the ecosystems which women tend to nurture much better in the context of their agriculture. So I just thought that was a sort of a new perspective that I hadn't really thought about in relation to climate-smart agriculture until you raised it, Ramona.
As with everything else that we see with food and environment and climate, Via Campesina has taught us that Pachamama would be doing just fine if it weren't for all the natural papas.
Right. So in the interest of time, we have to wrap up here pretty quickly, but I'm going to take one more question from our stream over here, and I want to put it to all of you. It's to all three of you. It's from a group called Engineering Life, which is a social science research project. So I think this might be some SynBio folks wanting to have their say, and they say, what kind of possibilities might SynBio have if they produced technologies that were IP free, that weren't sort of patented and owned by companies that demanded royalties, but if there were sort of a open source synthetic biology that maybe consulted with and worked with small-scale farmers, are there any possibilities there? Why don't we start with Ramona? Who, I think you're on mute, Ramona. Oh, Ramona. Why don't we start with Teresa?
Okay.
Oh, wait, there she is. Okay.
I'm sorry, it's going slower now, the computer.
Gotcha.
Well, to me, the question doesn't really make so much sense. It's like I am asked if I want Coca-Cola for free or if I want Coca-Cola to pay for. It's you know, we are talking about a multitude of reasons why these new projects are bad. It's not just economic reasons, it's also human rights based reasons, environmental reasons, and so on. I would like to point out one more time, because I know we're getting close to the end, that the importance of the youth in agriculture, it's also very strategic, and you know, it's highly important. Without the people that are now building the future, that are now taking over from their parents and grandparents, or just people that are you know, active now and they're growing older. Without them, without the present, we cannot build the future. So it's the involvement of the young, and making agriculture attractive and you know, an option for young people. It's of extreme importance. Just as a final point, and you know, about the question that was asked, really, I don't know, it doesn't seem to me very serious, that we can make a very serious point around it.
Okay, I need to make a brief intervention, and that is, I have just been informed that the group Engineering Life is not, in fact, biotech or synbio folks. They are part of the University of Edinburgh, and they study these matters, but they're not in the process of making them. So I misspoke there, and so that might have given a more sinister tint to the question. But anyway, let us move to Teresa.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a fair question, and I hear this talked about often in the context of GM crops as well. But I think if you take as the premise that I talked about earlier, if you agree with the premise that actually, in order to be able to have crop diversity in farmers' hands for the future, in order to be able to cope with a range of challenges, whether they be climate, pest, disease, whatever, you know, nutrition, health, crop diversity is necessary, and we need to have it available now and for the future, in order to be able to ensure we can, you know, continue producing food in the centuries to come. If we take that as a premise, but then we look at the investment, like the millions, in some cases tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars involved in developing each of these GM or synthetic biology crops, that's a large investment made to develop each one of these crops or genomes. And in order to recoup and make it worth that investment, you obviously have to grow it on a very large scale in order to make all that investment worth it. And so that's what we've seen in North America and some South American countries as well. And so for me, the idea that it seems quite clear that you would have to actually undermine biodiversity and crop diversity in the process of making it worth the cost of creating the crop in the first place. So I still think that although IP, intellectual property rights, are one of several issues of concern, It's not the only issue of concern. There are multiple other issues, including environmental, including biodiversity, including a whole range of other things that need to be taken into account. So focusing on that as the only issue isn't really seeing the full problem.
Pat?
I think open source, I agree very much with what Teresa just said, but open source, I think, strategies have been with us for hundreds of years, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and they tend to work very well until they become profitable. The moment they become profitable, suddenly they're no longer open source, and the guys working in the basement or the garage or the barn suddenly decide that they can make money out of this, and they jump ahead and command the marketplace. So I think it is often kind of naive to think that this is going to be different, that we can have DIY bio, do-it-yourself biotechnology, or do-it-yourself strategies this way that are going to be different from how these other technologies have been captured in the past. And I also really am concerned that in the spirit of Edinburgh and subsidiarity in European politics, the strategy has to always be from the ground up. It has to always be build from what you've got. And peasant agriculture via Campesina has a lot. It's on the ground. There's a lot going on. I wouldn't want to call it crowdsourcing, but the capacity of peasants working together to share information, to strategize, to challenge pests and diseases, to create new diversity for us is enormous. And that's where we should be building from, not from some high-tech lab place that really, again, as Teresa said, is incredibly expensive and doesn't really get the job done.
And Ramona, why don't you finish us off here? What else do you see about this question?
Well, I would like to. Yeah, I'd like to continue the idea of my predecessor speaker. Yeah, indeed, peasant farming, agroecology, food sovereignty is also about innovation. Is also about open source, of course. It's also, and it's about quality. It's about really feeding the world. It's everything that the industry is promising but failing to really put on the table. And in this light, I think that what we need to do together is to support more the peasants, the actors that are the most legitimate to propose solutions about the future of agriculture, to be acknowledged as innovators, to be acknowledged as one of the biggest investors in the world in agriculture, because peasants do not recuperate back their investments from public subsidies. They are not eligible for that. They are absolutely independent. And on their own in this, we are already feeding the world. We are the solution. We have it. It's there, and it still exists. We still have the chance, a tangible chance to maintain it, to help it grow. Yeah, I believe very much in solidarity, in what has been said so far, in all of these arguments that come in building a common strategy that hopefully leads to more action, to more involvement, to more awareness, both the large public but also decision makers who seem to be trapped now into false solutions proposed by the industry, trapped by corruption, trapped by all of these human weaknesses. So yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity, and yeah, let's hope for better.
Okay, well, I really appreciate everyone's time, and we got a question that just came in right under the pike that I can't resist. I'm a terrible moderator because I can't resist a good question. So hang with me for one more second here. We have a question from Canada. And it's mentioning that the Canadian government has signed the TPP, which is a Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the questioner wonders, it appears to threaten any serious effort to move away from concentration in cash crops for export, and this sort of reliance on GMOs. Meanwhile, small Canadian farmers are going out of business, which is also happening, in the United States and everywhere in the world. given that these governments are making these deals and participating in these deals that are obviously not in the interests of small-scale farmers, the questioner asked, what do we do? And I think that is a great way to end it. What is the response for people in the face of these sort of big forces and these decisions being made by governments, like the TPP? Pat, why don't you start?
I'm terrified to sound like Donald Trump or something. I am alarmed that the trade agreements being struck now, and Canada's in the center of pushing these trade deals in different parts of the world, are ones which just give more power to the corporations, which lock us into a technological mindset and intellectual property approaches that are devastating to diversity and to long-term food security. So that's there, and that's got to be fought. And I think, frankly, in Canada, we have a lot of opportunities, as a Canadian I can say this, to fight those battles still. I think that the government is perhaps slightly more sensitive than it used to be and more aware of the opposition, and I think the battles are not over for that. The battles have to be fought around the world. And that's without building walls. That's not the Trump approach. Right. It is a strategy which really recognizes our global humanity and recognizes that food security is a global issue. And we can't surrender. To give us this day our daily bread isn't a prayer to be made to Monsanto.
Right.
And maybe I'll just add to that, and I think that perhaps the solution is beyond just agriculture policy, but I think really looking at how governments are, relating to their populations and their corporations as a whole. I mean, they have an obligation to provide services to protect their citizens, to protect their food security, and to protect their farmers. And if they're going to provide the services they need, then they need to basically tax corporations in order to have the income and give the farmers and the food system the support it needs. They also need to regulate so that they can make sensible decisions about joined up systems, that joined up, thinking. When we join up our thinking about agriculture, about climate, about social issues, then we come to, about the environment, then we come to agroecology as the clear solution. But with policy making so disparate, but, by different departments and different logics driving different departments, and particularly, profit and corporations driving a lot of the government agenda, that means that governments aren't really able to regulate or enable or to give farmers the support that they actually need. So yeah, I would say it takes even a higher step up. We need to make sure that that governments are really doing what they need to do, and they shouldn't be ceding their power, because as they step back and minimize taxes, etc., they're actually giving the opportunity for corporations to deliver these services that they no longer want to provide. So this is where climate smart agriculture and the Monsantos, etc., step in, because we no longer realize that we have the right to demand this kind of regulation, protection, and services.
Ramona? And don't forget to unmute, please. There we go. I think. Ramona?
Okay.
Yes.
How about now?
Now we can hear you.
I would like to add something about TTIP, just TTIP specifically. It's an obvious and direct threat towards food security and food sovereignty. It's quite clear that just fighting against bad solutions, bad economic proposals such as this transatlantic and transnational economic treaties, it's not enough. We have to also fight by empowering our own solutions instead of just always fighting, just always defending ourselves. we have to take an offensive lead as well by really empowering our capacity to feed ourselves, to strengthen our processes, to strengthen our ways to intervene in the official high-level political decision-making, because we can't just always run away from the problems that are thrown on us. We also have to be able to lead I don't know how to say it. Maybe offense. It's a bit too tough, but to lead the solution, to push for our solutions, because yeah, we have to be more strategic than just fighting against and just answering always the proposals of the industry that speaks through the governments and the high-level officials. So yeah, we have to support more the food sovereignty process around the world. For example, in Europe, we have now this autumn, in October, we have a culminating point for the European and Central Asia food sovereignty process. That is going to culminate with a forum, extremely wide forum. We will have guests from all the other continents to support and assist the European and the Central Asia process. We are centering our process around the policies, around the rights for workers, around food distribution, around food production and consumption, and access to natural resources such as land, seeds, and water. I believe more in ourselves and in our processes than in the fear of the false solutions.
All right, well, this is a conversation that I could literally have all day with you people, but I believe it is now time to wrap up. It's been wonderful. And obviously, what we were talking about today is really starting points. There's much more to say, much more to read and listen. So I encourage everyone to go to the Via Campesina website, to go to the Etc. Group website and get this report, Outsmarting Nature, and to go and check out Teresa's work from her organization, and learn more about this and continue this conversation. But that is it for right now, and thank you for tuning in.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Tom, for hosting.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you, everyone.